The first shot rang out across the moonlit plain, piercing the night as Dawn Nichols huddled against the weathered trunk of a cottonwood tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pack of coyotes had surrounded her, their eyes gleaming like malevolent stars in the darkness, drawing closer with each passing moment. She had accepted her fate when the thunderous report of a rifle split the air, followed by another, and another until only silence remained. Wyoming Territory, 1876. The western frontier was no place for a woman alone, but Dawn had little choice after her father's passing left her with nothing but debts, and a letter from her aunt in Sacramento offering a fresh start. The stagecoach had been attacked 2 days prior, the driver and guard killed, and Dawn had been running ever since, surviving on wild berries and stream water until the coyotes found her. "Madam, you all right?" The deep voice startled her almost as much as the gunshots had. A tall figure approached through the darkness, rifle still smoking in his hands. As he drew closer, the moonlight revealed a man with broad shoulders and a weathered face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his Stetson hat. "Why, yes," Dawn managed, her voice cracking from thirst and fear. "They would have killed me, that they would have." The stranger knelt beside her, offering a canteen. "Name's Henry Harrington. Most folks call me Hank." Dawn accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips as she'd learned to do during her days alone in the wilderness. Dawn Nichols. "I was headed to Sacramento when our coach was attacked." Hank's expression darkened. "Comancheros. They've been hitting the stages between here and Fort Laramie." He glanced around, his hand never straying far from the revolver at his hip. "It's not safe here. My camp's about a mile east." "Can you walk?" Dawn nodded, though her legs trembled when she tried to stand. Without comment, Hank offered his arm for support. His touch was gentle despite his rough appearance, and Dawn found herself leaning into his strength more than she'd intended. The camp was modest but well organized, a small fire burning low, a canvas lean-to, and a pair of horses tethered nearby. Dawn sank gratefully onto a bedroll Hank indicated, watching as he stoked the fire. "You're lucky," he said after a moment. "Coyotes don't usually go after humans unless they're starving or rabid. I don't feel lucky." Dawn pulled her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Everyone on that stage is dead, and I've been wandering for days." Hank handed her a tin plate with beans and salt pork. "Eat. We'll figure out what to do come morning." Dawn didn't need to be told twice. She ate ravenously while Hank watched the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. In the flickering glow, she could see him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and a strong jawline covered in several days' growth of beard. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. "Are you a lawman?" she asked finally, setting aside her empty plate. Hank shook his head. "Scout, work for the army sometimes, guide settlers others. Was heading to Cheyenne when I heard your scream." "I'm grateful you did." Dawn tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after days in the wilderness. "I owe you my life, Mr. Harrington." "Hank," he corrected, "and you don't owe me anything. No decent man would leave a woman to the coyotes." He looked at her appraisingly. "You need rest. Take the lean-to. I'll keep watch." Dawn wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't some delicate flower, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. With a mumbled thanks, she crawled into the shelter and was asleep almost instantly. Dawn awoke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of morning. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in Pennsylvania in her father's house. Then reality rushed back. The stagecoach, the attack, the days of wandering, and finally, the coyotes and her unexpected savior. She emerged from the lean-to to find Hank crouched by the fire, frying bacon in a small skillet. He nodded in greeting, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Sleep well. Better than I have in days," Dawn admitted, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. The bitter liquid scalded her throat but sent warmth spreading through her limbs. What happens now? Hank turned the bacon with a practiced flick of his knife. Nearest town's Sweetwater Crossing, about 3 days' ride. I can take you there, help you arrange passage to Sacramento. Dawn stared into her coffee. I have no money. The Comancheros took everything. I reckon the stage company owes you a ticket, considering the circumstances. Hank divided the bacon between 2 plates, adding hardtack to each. Besides, I'm heading that direction anyway. Dawn studied him. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Out here, folks help each other or they don't survive long. He handed her a plate. And like I said, I'm headed that way. No trouble taking you along. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Dawn spoke again. I can't ride. A ghost of a smile crossed Hank's face. Figured as much. You'll ride with me until we can get you your own mount in Sweetwater. Dawn's cheeks flushed at the thought of such close proximity to this stranger, but she had little choice. After they finished eating, Hank efficiently broke camp while Dawn watched, feeling useless. Here. Hank tossed her a bundle of cloth. Found these in my pack, won't fit right, but they're cleaner than what you've got. Dawn unfolded a spare shirt and trousers, obviously Hank's. I can't wear men's clothing. Hank raised an eyebrow as he secured a pack to his saddle. Madam, out here, practicality trumps propriety. Your dress is torn half to pieces, and we've got rough country ahead. Dawn wanted to argue, but knew he was right. Swallowing her pride, she retreated behind the lean-to to change. The clothes hung loosely on her smaller frame, but with the sleeves rolled up and the trousers secured with a length of rope, they would do. She emerged feeling self-conscious but considerably more comfortable. Hank gave her an appraising look but made no comment as he helped her onto his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, before swinging up behind her. Dawn tensed as his arms reached around her to take the reins, his chest solid against her back. Relax, he said, his breath warm against her ear. Old Rusty here is steady as they come. Just move with the horse and you'll be fine. They set off at an easy pace, heading east across the rolling prairie. Dawn gradually relaxed as she grew accustomed to the rhythm of the horse's gait and the secure feeling of Hank's arms around her. Despite her circumstances, she found herself noticing the beauty of the landscape, the golden grasses swaying in the breeze, the distant purple silhouettes of mountains, the vast blue bowl of the sky overhead. It's beautiful, she murmured, almost to herself. That it is. Hank's voice held a note of pride. Most folks back east think it's nothing but desert and savages out here, but this country gets in your blood. Is that why you stay, even with the dangers? Hank was silent for a moment. Partly. Man can breathe out here. Be judged by what he does, not who his daddy was or how much money he has. Dawn thought about her life in Pennsylvania, the whispers after her father's business failed, the pitying looks, the former friends who suddenly had no time for the daughter of a ruined man. I think I understand that. They rode in companionable silence for a time until Hank tensed behind her. Hold up. Dawn followed his gaze to a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. A town, no town there. Hank guided the horse behind a low rise, dismounting quickly. Stay with Rusty, I'm going to have a look. Before Dawn could protest, he had disappeared over the ridge, moving with surprising stealth for such a large man. She waited anxiously, one hand on the horse's bridle, straining her ears for any sound. After what seemed an eternity, Hank reappeared, his expression grim. Comancheros. Same ones that hit your stage, I'd wager. Dawn's heart raced. How many? 6 that I could see. They've got a camp in that draw yonder, and they're not alone. Hank's jaw tightened. They've got prisoners, 2 men and a woman. Survivors from the stage, Dawn asked hopefully. Hank shook his head. Different coach, looks like, more recent. We have to help them, Dawn said immediately. Hank gave her a measuring look. That's 6 armed men against 1. Those ain't odds I'd usually take. But we can't just leave them. Dawn's voice rose with indignation. Those people will suffer the same fate as my fellow passengers if we do nothing. Hank sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're right, but we need a plan, not a suicide charge. He thought for a moment. I might be able to pick off 1 or 2 from a distance, cause some confusion. If the prisoners can take advantage of that. I could help, Dawn offered. Hank's refusal was immediate. Too dangerous, Mr. Harrington, Dawn said firmly, drawing herself up to her full height, which still only brought her to his shoulder. I may be a woman, but I am not helpless. My father taught me to shoot, and I've had enough of being a victim. Hank studied her face, seemingly weighing her determination against his better judgment. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you follow my lead exactly. No heroics, Dawn agreed, and Hank outlined his plan. It was risky, but with surprise on their side, they might manage it. He gave Dawn his revolver, keeping the rifle for himself. Remember, he said as they prepared to move into position, if things go wrong, you run. Don't wait for me, don't look back. Just get on Rusty and ride east until you hit water, then follow it north. You'll reach Sweetwater eventually. Dawn wanted to argue but recognized the sense in his words. Be careful, she said instead. Hank's expression softened momentarily. Always am. They separated, Hank circling to find a good vantage point while Dawn crept closer to the camp, keeping to the sparse cover of sagebrush and rocky outcroppings. From her position, she could see the prisoners. 2 men tied to a wagon wheel and a woman bound separately near the fire. The Comancheros were lounging around, passing a bottle between them, apparently unconcerned about pursuit. Dawn's hand tightened on the revolver as she waited for Hank's signal. When the first rifle shot cracked across the draw, she was ready. One of the Comancheros fell immediately, clutching his chest. The others scrambled for weapons as a second shot took down another. Dawn aimed carefully at a man rushing toward the prisoners and squeezed the trigger, the revolver's recoil stronger than she expected. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to make the man dive for cover. Chaos erupted in the camp. Hank's third shot found another target, and the remaining Comancheros began firing wildly in the direction of his position. Dawn took aim again, steadier this time, and managed to wing one of the bandits. The man howled in pain, dropping his gun. Dawn saw her chance. While the remaining Comancheros were focused on Hank's position, she darted forward to the prisoners. The woman's eyes widened in shock as Dawn appeared beside her, knife in hand to cut her bonds. Run, Dawn hissed, moving to free the men next. Head for the rocks to the east. The freed prisoners needed no encouragement. They fled as Dawn turned to follow, only to find her path blocked by one of the Comancheros. His eyes blazed with fury as he raised his gun. Dawn froze, the revolver suddenly heavy in her hand. Before she could react, a shot rang out and the man crumpled at her feet. Hank emerged from the smoke, rifle still raised. Time to go, he said tersely, grabbing her elbow and pulling her toward where the prisoners had fled. Behind them, the remaining Comancheros were regrouping. Bullets kicked up dust at their heels as they ran. They found the prisoners huddled behind a rocky outcropping. The woman was sobbing quietly while one of the men, older with a distinguished gray beard, tried to comfort her. The other man, younger and dressed in the remains of a suit, clutched a bleeding arm. "Thank you," the older man said as Hank and Dawn approached. "I'm Theodore Walsh, banker from Cheyenne. This is my daughter Rebecca and her fiancé, James Cooper." Hank nodded curtly, his attention on the draw below. "They'll be coming after us soon as they regroup. We need to move. Our horses." Dawn asked, "Too risky to go back for them. Rusty's about a quarter-mile northeast of here. We'll have to share." They set off immediately, Hank supporting the wounded James while Dawn helped Rebecca, who seemed to be in shock. Theodore kept up remarkably well for his age, his face set with determination. The stage was carrying a payroll, he explained as they hurried across the rocky terrain. $20,000 for the mine at Silver Creek. Those men knew exactly what they were after. Hank's expression darkened. "This is the third stage hit in as many weeks. Someone's feeding them information." They reached Rusty without incident, but the horse couldn't possibly carry all 5 of them. After a brief discussion, it was decided that Rebecca and James would ride double, with Dawn walking alongside and Hank and Theodore bringing up the rear, watching for pursuit. They traveled until dusk, making painfully slow progress across the uneven ground. When they finally stopped in a sheltered ravine, everyone was exhausted. James's wound needed attention, and they were all hungry and thirsty. Hank produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, along with the canteen, which they shared sparingly. Dawn helped clean James's wound, a bullet graze that looked worse than it was while Hank scouted the area. "You were very brave back there," Rebecca said quietly as Dawn bandaged her fiancé's arm with a strip torn from Hank's spare shirt. "I've never seen a woman handle a gun before." Dawn smiled tiredly. Necessity teaches quickly. Besides, Mr. Harrington did most of the work. Still, Theodore interjected, not many women would have had the courage to do what you did. We owe you both our lives. Hank returned with the news that there was no sign of pursuit yet, but they should move out at first light. "They'll have picked up our trail by now, but they'll be cautious after losing half their men." "What about Sweetwater Crossing?" Dawn asked. "Is it still 3 days away?" "On foot with wounded, more like 5 if we're lucky." Hank's face was grim in the gathering darkness, "and we won't outrun them that long." "So what do we do?" James asked, his voice tight with pain. Hank considered for a moment. "There's a line shack about a day's march from here. Belongs to the Circle B ranch. We might find horses there, or at least shelter to make a stand if it comes to that." The possibility hung heavily in the air as they settled down for the night. With only one bedroll between the 5 of them, they huddled together for warmth, taking turns keeping watch. Dawn found herself next to Hank during her shift, his solid presence reassuring in the vast darkness. "Thank you," she said softly, "for back there, for all of this." Hank glanced at her, his profile sharp against the starlit sky. "You did good today. Not many would have kept their head like that. I was terrified," Dawn admitted. "Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear." Hank's voice was low, thoughtful. "My pa told me that before he rode off to fight in the war, never came back." Dawn was silent, absorbing this rare personal detail. "My father was too old for the war, but he lost everything afterward. The railroad changed everything, made his shipping business obsolete. He died of a heart attack the day the bank foreclosed on our home." "I'm sorry," Hank said simply. "It's why I was heading to Sacramento. My aunt lives there, has a boarding house, said she could use the help." Dawn hugged her knees to her chest. "Seems like another lifetime ago now." "You'll get there," Hank said with quiet confidence. "Strikes me you're the type that lands on her feet." Dawn smiled despite herself. "I hope you're right." They fell into companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Dawn found herself studying Hank's profile when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the straight line of his nose, the firm set of his jaw. There was something compelling about him, beyond his obvious capability and courage, a depth that belied his rough exterior. Morning came too soon. They set out at dawn, Hank and Theodore again taking rear guard, while Dawn walked alongside the horse carrying Rebecca and James. The day grew hot as the sun climbed higher and their progress slowed. Water became a pressing concern, with the canteen nearly empty by midday. They were crossing a dry stream bed when Hank suddenly held up his hand, signaling a halt. He cocked his head, listening intently, then motioned everyone to take cover behind a cluster of rocks. "Riders," he whispered as they huddled together. "Coming fast from the south." Dawn's heart sank. "The Comancheros, can't tell yet, could be ranch hands from the Circle B." Hank checked his rifle. "Stay hidden until I know for sure." He crept to a better vantage point, leaving the rest of them to wait anxiously. Dawn held the revolver ready, trying to steady her breathing. Beside her, Rebecca trembled while James held her protectively, his face pale from pain and exhaustion. Minutes stretched like hours before Hank returned, his expression tense but no longer alarmed. "Not Comancheros, Army patrol, lieutenant and 6 men." Relief washed over the group, but Hank remained cautious. "I'll signal them." "Dawn, keep that revolver handy just in case. Trust is a luxury out here." Hank moved to an exposed position and waved his hat, The patrol spotted him almost immediately, changing course to intercept. As they drew closer, Dawn could see blue uniforms and the glint of brass buttons in the sunlight. The lieutenant, a young man with a neat mustache and serious eyes, reined in his horse a safe distance away. "Identify yourselves," he called. "Henry Harrington," Hank replied. "Scout for Fort Laramie. Got survivors from a stage robbery here, including Theodore Walsh, banker from Cheyenne." The lieutenant's posture relaxed slightly. "Lieutenant Michael Prescott, 7th Cavalry. We're tracking a band of Comancheros that hit a stage 3 days ago. Same bunch that took these folks," Hank confirmed. "We tangled with them yesterday. Killed 3, wounded at least 1 more. They're probably still on our trail." The lieutenant dismounted, ordering his men to form a perimeter as he approached. "Mr. Walsh, are you all right, sir?" Theodore stepped forward. "Yes, Lieutenant, thanks to Mr. Harrington and Miss Nichols here. These outlaws were after the Silver Creek payroll." Lieutenant Prescott nodded grimly. "They got it too, found the strongbox empty when we came across the stage." He turned to Hank. "You say they're following you?" "Almost certainly. They lost men and face. That combination makes people stupid and dangerous." The lieutenant made a quick decision. "We'll escort you to Fort Collins. It's closer than Sweetwater Crossing, and we can get the wounded man proper medical attention there." "What about the Comancheros?" Dawn asked. "We'll deal with them if they show themselves." The lieutenant's confidence seemed somewhat forced to Dawn, but she was too relieved at their rescue to question it. They redistributed the riders, with James on a spare mount and Rebecca riding double with a young private. Dawn found herself sharing a horse with Hank again, his arms steady around her as they rode. "You trust these soldiers?" she asked quietly as they set off. "Prescott seems green, but his sergeant knows what he's doing," Hank replied, his voice low near her ear. "And right now, they're our best chance of getting everyone to safety." They rode hard for the remainder of the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and allow the wounded James to recover his strength. By nightfall, they had covered considerable ground, entering more broken country with sandstone formations rising like sentinels from the prairie. They made camp in a defensible position, with good visibility in all directions. The soldiers established a watch rotation, while Hank helped James tend to his wound, which was showing signs of infection. Dawn sat with Rebecca, trying to offer comfort to the clearly traumatized young woman. "Were you going to be married soon?" Dawn asked, hoping to distract her from their situation. Rebecca managed a small smile. "Next month. James works for my father's bank. That's why they were both traveling with the payroll." Her smile faltered. "I insisted on coming along. I wanted to see the West before we settled down in Cheyenne." "You'll still have your wedding," Dawn assured her, "and quite a story to tell your grandchildren someday." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "If we survive this." "We will," Dawn said with more confidence than she felt. "Lieutenant Prescott says we should reach Fort Collins by tomorrow evening." As the night deepened, Dawn found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She sat at the edge of the camp, watching the stars and listening to the soft murmur of the sentries as they changed shifts. Footsteps approached and she looked up to see Hank standing beside her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, lowering himself to sit on a rock nearby. Dawn shook her head. "Too much happening, I suppose." Hank offered her a cigarette, which she declined. He lit one for himself, the match briefly illuminating his face. In that fleeting light, Dawn saw weariness etched in the lines around his eyes. "What will you do?" she asked. "After you get us to Fort Collins." Hank exhaled a stream of smoke that disappeared into the darkness. "Head to Cheyenne eventually, got business there." And after that, he shrugged. "Always more work for a scout, armies pushing deeper into Indian Territory every year. Settlers need guides, stage companies need outriders." "Sounds lonely," Dawn observed. "It can be." Hank studied the glowing tip of his cigarette. "But it suits me. Never was one for staying in one place too long." Dawn thought about Sacramento, about her aunt's boarding house and the life that awaited her there. It seemed small and confined suddenly, compared to the vast open spaces she'd traversed these past days. "What about you?" Hank asked. "Still set on Sacramento, I suppose I should be," Dawn replied slowly. "It's the sensible choice, safe, secure, but—" She smiled at how easily he read her hesitation. "But I'm not sure I'm the same person who boarded that stage in Laramie. This country, these experiences, they change you, don't they?" Hank nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "That they do. For better or worse depends on the person, I reckon." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the other side of the camp. Lieutenant Prescott was speaking urgently with his sergeant, pointing to the south. Hank was on his feet immediately, moving to join them. Dawn followed, catching the lieutenant's words. "Definitely campfires." "At least 3, maybe 4. How far?" Hank asked, scanning the horizon. 5 miles, maybe less," the sergeant replied. "Coming from the direction we left the Comancheros. Could be them," Hank agreed, "or could be Cheyenne hunting party. Hard to tell at night." Lieutenant Prescott looked uncertain. "If it's the Comancheros and they catch up to us in open country tomorrow." "We push on," Hank said decisively. "Now, under cover of darkness. There's a canyon ahead that narrows to a pass. Good place for an ambush, but if we get through it before they catch up, the terrain opens into rolling hills. Better for your cavalry to maneuver." The lieutenant hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Sergeant, get the men ready. We move out in 10 minutes." The camp dissolved into controlled activity as the soldiers prepared to depart. Dawn helped Rebecca gather her few possessions while Hank assisted James onto his horse. Theodore looked pale but determined as he mounted. "Stay close," Hank told Dawn as he helped her up. "Going to be a hard ride, and we can't afford to lose anyone in the dark." They set off in single file, moving as quickly as the rough terrain and darkness would allow. Dawn clung to Hank, feeling the tension in his body as he guided their horse along the treacherous path. The distant campfires were no longer visible, but their threat hung over the group like a shadow. The canyon Hank had mentioned appeared as a darker silhouette against the night sky, its walls rising steeply on either side. As they entered its confines, Dawn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The passage narrowed until they were forced to proceed in single file, the walls so close that Dawn could have reached out to touch them. "Almost through," Hank murmured as they neared the end of the pass. "Just another quarter mile." The shot came without warning, echoing deafeningly off the canyon walls. One of the soldiers cried out, tumbling from his horse. More shots followed, and suddenly the narrow pass was filled with gunfire and shouting. "Ambush," Lieutenant Prescott yelled unnecessarily. "Take cover," but there was nowhere to take cover in the narrow confines of the pass. Hank reacted instantly, sliding from the horse and pulling Dawn down with him. They crouched behind a fallen boulder as bullets whined overhead. "Stay here," Hank ordered, pressing the revolver into her hands. "Don't move unless I tell you to." Before Dawn could protest, he was gone, moving with surprising speed toward the front of the column where the lieutenant was trying to organize a defense. Dawn peered around the boulder, trying to make sense of the chaos. The soldiers were returning fire, but their attackers remained hidden in the darkness above. A scream drew her attention to Rebecca, who had fallen from her horse and lay exposed in the middle of the path. Without thinking, Dawn darted from cover, keeping low as she ran to the other woman's side. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from her foot, but she reached Rebecca unharmed. "Come on," Dawn urged, dragging the terrified woman toward the shelter of the canyon wall. "We need to find better cover." Together they stumbled toward a shallow overhang, joined moments later by James and Theodore. The banker was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder but seemed otherwise unhurt. "Where's Harrington?" he asked, his voice tight with pain. "Up front with the lieutenant," Dawn replied, straining to see through the darkness and gun smoke. The firing had become more sporadic, punctuated by shouts and the frightened whinnying of horses. Suddenly, Hank appeared beside them, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like blood. "We're pinned down. Prescott's dead and the sergeant's organizing a retreat." "Retreat where?" James demanded. "They've got us trapped in this canyon." "Not necessarily," Hank replied grimly. "There's a side passage about 50 yards back. It's narrow, but it leads to a plateau above. If we can reach it, we might be able to circle around behind them." "What about the soldiers?" Dawn asked. "The sergeant's holding the pass with what's left of his men, buying us time." Hank's expression made it clear what that meant. "We need to move now while there's still confusion." There was no time to argue. They followed Hank back the way they had come, staying close to the canyon wall. Dawn could hear the continuing gunfire behind them, less frequent now but still deadly. The side passage Hank had mentioned was barely visible, a dark fissure in the rock face. "It's tight," he warned, "but passable. Follow me and stay quiet." The passage was even narrower than it had appeared, forcing them to squeeze through in single file. Dawn helped Rebecca, who seemed on the verge of collapse, while Theodore supported the weakening James. Hank led the way, occasionally reaching back to assist when the path became particularly treacherous. They emerged finally onto a flat expanse of rock overlooking the canyon. From this vantage point, Dawn could see the muzzle flashes below as the remaining soldiers continued their desperate defense. On the opposite rim, dark figures moved among the rocks, the Comancheros who had set the ambush. "Now what?" Theodore whispered, helping James sink to the ground. Hank surveyed the situation, his expression calculating. "We need to create a diversion. Draw their attention away from the soldiers below." "How?" Dawn asked. In answer, Hank pointed to a cluster of loose rocks near the canyon's edge. "Those boulders are barely stable. If we can dislodge them." Understanding dawned. "A rock slide." "Exactly. It might give the soldiers down there a chance to retreat, and it'll certainly distract the Comancheros." Hank turned to Theodore. "Stay with your daughter and James. Dawn, I need your help." Together they moved to the rock pile, careful to stay low and out of sight of the attackers on the opposite rim. The boulders were massive but precariously balanced. "On three," Hank whispered, positioning himself against the largest stone. "1, 2, 3. They pushed with all their strength. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding rumble, the boulder shifted, tipping forward and dislodging others as it went. The rumble became a roar as more rocks joined the cascade, tumbling down into the canyon below. Shouts of alarm rose from the Comancheros as the avalanche crashed down, filling the narrow pass with debris and dust. Hank grabbed Dawn's hand, pulling her back from the edge as gunfire erupted in their direction. "They've spotted us," he said unnecessarily. "We need to move." They rejoined the others, helping James to his feet. "There's a trail along this ridge," Hank explained, pointing east. "If we follow it, we should be able to circle around to the open country beyond the canyon." "And then what?" Rebecca asked, her voice trembling. "Fort Collins is still our best bet," Hank replied. "It's about 15 miles northeast of here. If we can stay ahead of them until daylight, we might find help along the way." They set off along the ridge, moving as quickly as James's condition would allow. Dawn helped support the injured man, aware of his labored breathing and the heat radiating from his wound. Infection was taking hold, and without proper medical attention, he wouldn't last much longer. Behind them, they could hear shouts and occasional gunfire as the Comancheros regrouped. The rockslide had bought them time, but how much remained to be seen. The night seemed endless as they made their way along the treacherous ridge, every step bringing fresh challenges. Dawn's feet were raw inside her borrowed boots, and her muscles screamed with exhaustion, but she pressed on, drawing strength from Hank's unwavering determination. He moved ahead of the group, scouting the path, then doubling back to help where needed. His stamina seemed inexhaustible, though Dawn knew he must be as tired as the rest of them. The first hint of dawn found them descending from the ridge into rolling prairie, the canyon and its nightmares receding behind them. They paused briefly in the shelter of a shallow arroyo, sharing the last of their water. James had grown delirious, mumbling incoherently as Theodore and Rebecca tried to comfort him. How much farther? Dawn asked Hank quietly, aware of the growing desperation in their situation. 10 miles, maybe 12, he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. But I'm more concerned about what's behind us. Dawn followed his gaze back toward the canyon. In the growing light, she could make out distant figures on horseback emerging from the pass they had so narrowly escaped. They're still coming. And they have horses, Hank added grimly. We need to find cover, make a stand if necessary. Theodore overheard them. James won't survive another firefight. He needs a doctor, and soon. Hank nodded, his expression troubled. I know, let me think. While the others rested, Hank climbed to the top of the arroyo for a better view. Dawn joined him, ignoring her protesting muscles. Together they surveyed the landscape, miles of open prairie stretching to the east, with a line of cottonwoods marking a distant creek or river. If we could reach those trees, Hank mused, we'd have better cover. But they'd run us down long before we got there. Dawn finished the thought. Hank turned to her, his expression resolute. Not if someone delayed them. Dawn's heart clenched as she understood his meaning. No. Absolutely not. It makes sense, Dawn. I can lead them away, buy you time to get the others to safety. And get yourself killed in the process. Dawn shook her head vehemently. There has to be another way. If you have a better idea, I'm listening. Hank's voice was gentle but firm. James is dying. Rebecca and her father are exhausted. They won't make it without help. Dawn knew he was right, but the thought of him sacrificing himself for them for her was unbearable. In the short time she had known him, Henry Harrington had become more important to her than she cared to admit. I'm coming with you, she said finally. It was Hank's turn to shake his head. No, the others need you. You're stronger than you know, Dawn. Get them to Fort Collins. Before she could argue further, he took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. I'm not planning on dying today. Just buying you time. I know this country better than those Comancheros. I'll meet you at the fort. Dawn wanted to believe him, but the odds were overwhelming. She squeezed his hand, words failing her. To her surprise, Hank leaned forward and kissed her, brief but tender, his lips warm despite their cracked dryness. For luck, he said softly, releasing her hand. Now go wake the others. You need to move out while those riders are still far enough away. Dawn returned to the group with a heavy heart, explaining Hank's plan. Theodore immediately understood the gravity of the sacrifice being offered, though Rebecca seemed too exhausted to fully comprehend. He's a brave man, Theodore said quietly as they prepared to leave. We owe him our lives twice over now. Dawn could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. She watched as Hank checked his rifle one last time, his movements precise and unhurried despite the approaching danger. Head for the cottonwoods, he instructed. Follow the watercourse northeast. It'll lead you toward Fort Collins. With luck, you'll encounter a patrol or a homestead along the way. We'll send help, Theodore promised. Hank nodded, his eyes finding Dawn's for a long moment. So much remained unsaid between them, possibilities that might never be realized now. Then he turned away, moving quickly up the arroyo and disappearing over its rim. Dawn led the others eastward, supporting James between herself and Theodore while Rebecca stumbled alongside. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Dawn stopped involuntarily, looking back in the distance. She could make out a solitary figure on a ridge, firing methodically at pursuers below. Hank had found himself a defensible position and was making good on his promise to delay the Comancheros. Even as she watched, she saw him abandon the position, running to another vantage point as riders moved to flank him. Come on, Theodore urged gently. Don't waste what he's giving us. With a last look back, Dawn continued eastward, each step taking her further from the man who had saved her from coyotes on a moonlit night that now seemed a lifetime ago. The sounds of gunfire grew fainter as they pushed on, until finally silence fell across the prairie. Dawn refused to consider what that might mean. They reached the cottonwood grove near midday, collapsing gratefully into the shade. James was barely conscious, his skin burning with fever. Rebecca bathed his face with water from the small creek, while Theodore fashioned a crude travois from branches and his coat. "We can't carry him much further," he admitted to Dawn. "But if we can pull him on this." Dawn nodded, helping to secure James to the makeshift stretcher. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound caught her attention. She tensed, fearing the Comancheros had caught up to them after all. "Horses," Theodore confirmed, his expression grim. "Several of them. They had no weapons, no means of defense." Dawn looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the cottonwood grove offered little concealment. They were trapped. The riders appeared at the edge of the trees, silhouetted against the bright sky. Dawn stepped protectively in front of Rebecca, prepared to face whatever came next. Then she heard a familiar voice call out, "Dawn." "Theodore." Relief flooded through her as Hank rode into the grove, followed by several men in cavalry uniforms. He dismounted quickly, striding toward them with a slight limp but otherwise appearing unharmed. "How?" Dawn asked, unable to form a more coherent question. Hank's tired face broke into a smile. "Ran into a patrol from Fort Collins. Lieutenant Prescott had sent a messenger ahead before the ambush. They were already on their way to find us." The cavalry officer with Hank dismounted, introducing himself as Captain Wilson. "We've got a wagon about a mile back. We'll get your wounded man to the fort infirmary." As the soldiers helped transfer James to a proper stretcher, Dawn turned to Hank. "The Comancheros." "3 dead, the rest scattered." He rubbed his shoulder, which Dawn now noticed was stained with blood. "Got winged, but nothing serious." "Nothing serious," Dawn repeated, her voice rising with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "You could have been killed." Hank's expression softened. "But I wasn't. Told you I'd meet you at the fort, didn't I?" The journey to Fort Collins passed in a blur for Dawn. James was placed in the wagon with Rebecca by his side, while Dawn rode double with Hank. The steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, and the solid warmth of Hank's body against hers lulled her into a state between wakefulness and sleep, the events of the past days catching up to her at last. Fort Collins appeared on the horizon by late afternoon, its wooden stockade and flag a welcome sight. They were greeted by the fort's commander, who had already been alerted to their situation. James was immediately taken to the infirmary, with Rebecca and Theodore following anxiously. Dawn found herself in the officers' quarters, where the commander's wife kindly provided clean clothes and a chance to bathe for the first time in days. The simple pleasure of warm water and soap nearly brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, dressed in a borrowed dress that was a bit too large but blessedly clean, she went in search of Hank. She found him on the parade ground, his shoulder freshly bandaged, watching as soldiers drilled in the fading sunlight. He turned at her approach, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "The doctor says James will recover," Dawn said, stopping beside him. "The infection responded to treatment. They're planning to marry as soon as he's well enough to stand." "Good news," Hank replied. "Theodore mentioned they'd like us to attend the wedding in Cheyenne." Dawn smiled. "Us?" Hank looked slightly uncomfortable, his usual confidence wavering. "I assumed. That is, if you're still heading to Sacramento." "I'm not," Dawn said simply. Hank's eyebrows rose. "No. No." Dawn took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "These past days have shown me something about myself, about what I want from life." "And what's that?" Hank asked softly. "Not to be safe, not to be confined." Dawn met his gaze steadily. "To live, Henry Harrington, really live. And I don't think I can do that in a boarding house in Sacramento." A slow smile spread across Hank's face. "Any thoughts on where you might do it instead?" Dawn stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "I thought perhaps Cheyenne might be a good place to start." "I hear they need teachers for the new school there." "They do at that," Hank agreed, his voice low. "And I might be persuaded to spend more time there myself. Army's offering me a permanent position as scout based out of Fort Russell." "Is that so?" Dawn's heart was racing now, hope blossoming within her. "And would this position allow you to court a schoolteacher properly, Mr. Harrington?" In answer, Hank closed the distance between them, his hands gentle as they framed her face. This kiss was different from the hurried one they'd shared in the arroyo deeper, filled with promise and possibility. When they finally parted, Dawn was breathless. "I believe it would," Hank murmured, his forehead resting against hers. In the weeks that followed, Dawn discovered a new life she had never imagined for herself. She and Hank traveled to Cheyenne for James and Rebecca's wedding, a joyful affair that celebrated not just the union of the young couple, but their shared survival against incredible odds. Theodore Walsh, grateful beyond words for his daughter's safety, used his influence to secure Dawn a position at Cheyenne's newly established school. The work was challenging but rewarding, giving her a sense of purpose she had lacked in Pennsylvania. Hank's duties as scout took him away periodically, but he always returned to Cheyenne to her. Their courtship progressed with a certainty that seemed inevitable to both of them. They had faced death together, saved each other in ways both literal and profound. What came after seemed natural, a continuation of a journey begun the night Hank fired into the darkness to save a stranger surrounded by coyotes. They were married the following spring, in a simple ceremony attended by James and Rebecca, Theodore, and several of Hank's fellow scouts and soldiers. Dawn wore a dress of pale blue silk, a wedding gift from Theodore, while Hank looked uncommonly respectable in a new suit that couldn't quite disguise the wilderness in him. "Never thought I'd find myself here," he admitted that night as they sat on the porch of the small house they had purchased on the outskirts of Cheyenne. A married man with a permanent address. Dawn leaned against his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple. "Regrets," Hank's arm tightened around her. "Not a one. This life it's more than I ever thought to have. Even with a wife who insists on learning to shoot a rifle and ride astride," Dawn teased, "especially because of that." Hank chuckled. "Though I draw the line at teaching you to throw a knife. A man needs some advantages." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Dawn reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. The stagecoach attack that should have ended her life had instead begun it anew. The terror of being surrounded by coyotes had led to meeting the man who would become her husband. Every hardship had ultimately guided her toward this happiness. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Hank asked, his fingers gently combing through her hair. Dawn smiled up at him. "About how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best ones. If that stage hadn't been attacked, if those coyotes hadn't surrounded me. If I hadn't heard your scream and fired into the night," Hank finished. "A lot of ifs, too many to count," Dawn agreed, "but they all led here to us. And for that I'm grateful." Hank bent to kiss her, a gesture that had become familiar but never routine. "As am I, Mrs. Harrington. As am I." 5 years later, Dawn stood on that same porch, watching as Hank taught their 3-year-old son Samuel to ride his first pony. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard as the gentle animal plodded in a circle, Hank's strong hands ensuring he wouldn't fall. Their daughter Elizabeth, barely a year old, cooed in Dawn's arms, reaching out toward her father and brother with chubby hands. Dawn bounced her gently, savoring the simple joy of the moment. Cheyenne had grown around them, the railroad bringing prosperity and new settlers. Dawn's school had expanded, though she now taught only part-time, preferring to spend more time with her children. Hank had gradually reduced his scouting duties as well, investing in a small ranch that provided a more stable income for their growing family. Life wasn't always easy. The Wyoming winters were harsh, and the territory still had its share of dangers. But they faced each challenge together, the bond forged during those desperate days on the run from Comancheros only strengthening with time. As if sensing her thoughts, Hank looked up, his smile warming her as it always did. With Samuel securely seated on the pony, he walked toward the porch, reaching up to touch Elizabeth's cheek before leaning in to kiss Dawn. "Happy?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. Dawn looked at her husband, their children, the home they had built together. Completely, she answered truthfully. And you? Hank's answer was simple but heartfelt. I found everything I never knew I was looking for the night I heard a scream and fired into the darkness. Dawn smiled, remembering that night the terror, the relief, the beginning of everything. Until only silence remained, she murmured. And you, Hank added softly. Always you. Together they watched as the sun set on another day in their shared life, the silence that surrounded them now not one of danger but of peace. The kind of silence that spoke of home, of family, of a love that had begun in the unlikeliest of circumstances, but had proven stronger than any challenge the wild frontier could present. In that moment, Dawn knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged, not in the confines of a Sacramento boarding house or the stifling propriety of Pennsylvania society, but here in the vastness of Wyoming, with a former scout who had once fired into the night to save a woman surrounded by coyotes, and in doing so had saved himself as well.